Welcome to another installment of Great Expectations chapters. Today we're going to talk about chapters 33, 34, and 35. And again, they drag on a little bit, so I'm going to try and just point out the important things. So Estella has arrived, and she demands that Pip take her to tea and then drive her to Miss Brandley's, which is where she's going to stay while she's in London. And she is almost like a robot in these commands of Pip, and she's not very personable at all. She is being controlled by Miss Havisham, and she's fully aware of that.
Why ask? We have no choice, you and I, but to obey instructions.
So Miss Havisham is really the puppet master, and she's controlling Estella, and in turn, Estella is in control of Pip. So nobody seems to be free in any of these chapters. And we find out in their conversation with one another that, first of all, the Pockets, Sarah and Camilla, hate Pip, which we already knew, but that in a sense, the reason they hate Pip so much, that's been entertaining for Miss Havisham. And so Estella says, you may set your mind at rest that those people will never in 100 years impair your ground with Miss Havisham. And so she lets Pip kiss her hand, and then she lets Pip kiss her cheek. But Pip acknowledges that it's like kissing a statue. Estella does not have any genuine feeling for Pip, and she says, oh, you ridiculous boy, won't you take warning? On their way back to Surrey Richmond, Estella does let her guard down for a moment when she talks about Mr. Jaggers. So she acknowledges that she's known Jaggers her whole life. She doesn't remember a time without him being a part of Miss Havisham's establishment. And he just sort of says, you know, I wonder, why does Miss Havisham want to part with you so soon after coming back from France? And Estella sighs, and for the first time, instead of calling him boy, she says, it's a part of Miss Havisham's plans for me, Pip. I'm to write to her constantly and see her regularly and report how I go on, I and the jewels, for they are nearly mine now.
Mrs. Brandley is to be paid a large sum of money to introduce me to society. The jewels and I.
Poor Pip. He's so in love with her, but all his connection with her leads to pain. After he drops her off, he thinks about going to see Matthew Pocket to talk to him about it. Maybe he can talk about love with Matthew Pocket, but Matthew Pocket's not there. And remember, his own family is a hot mess, and it's quite ironic how he's out right now lecturing on page 288 the management of children and servants, who were considered the very best textbooks on these themes. So even though he is an expert in the field, he is failing at it at home because Mrs. Pocket is having trouble finding the needles, and it's quite possible that the baby has taken the needles. Chapter 34 is Pip, really, and Herbert. I don't know if you've ever had a friend who's kind of a bad influence on you, who maybe leads you to do things that are not responsible. But Pip has led Herbert, who doesn't have any money and who does not have a secret benefactor, to spend lavishly and on credit. Now, this is before the days of credit cards, but you can still buy things on loan. And so both Pip and Herbert's debts are rapidly increasing. And so what they do is they sit down and they decide they're going to write out all of their debts. And in order to do this, they first get a very expensive set of pens and some fancy paper, and they order a special dinner and an expensive bottle of wine. So you can already see that when they're facing head on their debts, they're spending money to do so. And I don't know if you've ever been in this situation, maybe right now with this remote learning, but you get everything all set up, your fancy computer, you've got your desk space and everything, and then you're like, I'm gonna take a break now, but you actually accomplish nothing. So that's what Pip and Herbert are doing, is they're listing all of their debts. They're trying to leave a margin as if to overestimate how much they owe so that they can benefit from it in the long run. But they never come up with a plan on how to pay the debt. They never figure out a way to curb their spending. And so it's ironic on page 294 when Pip thinks, well, I'm a first-rate man of business, prompt, decisive, energetic, clear, and cool-headed. He's like, I know what I'm doing. And in a couple of chapters, Jaggers is going to ask Pip, hey, do you know how much money you've spent? And Pip's not going to know the answer. So even after going through all of this, he still won't know at what rate he's living at. So that's basically chapter 34, but it ends on a cliffhanger because a notice arrives at the door. Mrs. J. Gargery departed this life on Monday last at 20 minutes past 6 in the evening. Mrs. Joe is dead. Ding dong, the witch is dead. No more tickler, no more tar water. She's a goner. So Pip has to rapidly return to Kent, and he hasn't been to Kent to see Joe and Biddy in a really long time. The last time he was in Kent, he didn't visit them. And I don't know if I mentioned this, but he sent Joe a barrel of oysters and codfish, which would have been especially smelly in the days before refrigeration and not something I would imagine Joe would want to eat. Anyway, so when he returns to Kent, the objective correlative is lovely now that Mrs. Joe is dead. On page 296, it was fine summer weather, and as I walked along, I felt again like when I was a little helpless creature, but everything returned with a gentle tone. You know, it's almost a blessing that she's gone. And of course, Joe is heartbroken, wearing his little black cloak tied with a large bow under his chin, and he cries, "Pip, old chap, you knowed her when she was a fine figure of a..." And he can't even finish the sentence, fine figure of a woman. What's interesting in this chapter is that Trav is in charge of the funeral. So that is something we can add to Trav on the character chart, that Mr. Trav the tailor sort of arranges this whole funeral. And he has everyone, of course, wearing black. And he gives everybody handkerchiefs to catch their tears, but only Joe is crying. Nobody else is sad. And even Pumblechook is kind of dancing around trying to grab Pip's eye and do a may I handshake, just like the old times. But once the funeral is over, Pip gets to reconnect a little bit with Biddy. And so she remembers the fight that they had about the bad side of human nature. And Pip is a little unkind to her again. He says on page 300, "Biddy, I think you might have written to me about these sad matters." And she's like, "Oh." And she's so quiet. And they kind of move past that awkwardness. And we find out that Mrs. Joe's last words were Joe, pardon, and Pip. And that, I think, is important. Joe, pardon, Pip. We can look at that a couple of ways. One, maybe she's asking Joe to forgive Pip because Pip has been pulling, some stunts and not being around as much as he should be. But then again, I don't think Mrs. Joe is fully aware. So I think instead she's asking Joe to get Pip to pardon her. As we've talked about in this book, Pip is on a journey, and it's the journey of a Christian man where he starts off as an innocent child. Right now he's going through his sin stage, and then the third section, the last 19 chapters, are going to be him trying to redeem himself and seek forgiveness. Each character, for the most part, has their own little progression, and this seems to be Mrs. Joe's redemption. She's asking for forgiveness, and she dies. Now, some interesting clues are left. Bottom of page 301, Pip still doesn't know, and nobody knows, who whacked her. And so he asks, "Do you ever know what became of Orlick?" So Orlick is obviously a prime suspect, and Biddy says, "Well, I should think by the color of his clothes that he's working in the quarries." So Orlick is now wearing, he has dusty clothes, and that's important because he was working for Miss Havisham and he got fired from Jaggers, and now he works with rocks, and so he's got gray clothes. Well, if you remember gray parallels the convicts, and so that's just kind of an all tie-in together. And of course, Mrs. Joe was whacked with the leg iron from convict number 1, so I don't know, we'll have to wait and see. But then when Biddy and Pip are having this conversation, they're taking a walk on the marshes just like they did in chapter 17. And Pip says, "Well, why are you looking at that dark tree in the lane?" And Biddy says, "I saw him there the night that she died." Pip says, "Was that the last time you saw him there?" And Biddy says, "No, I've seen him since we've been walking here, but it's no use. He was there not a minute ago and now he's gone." So Orlick is the ultimate creeper. As you may remember, he slouches in from out of nowhere and shows up, unexpected. So here comes Orlick hovering around when Mrs. Joe has died. Is this too obvious that he is the one who whacked her? Maybe so. We also know that he loves Biddy, and so he might be just stalking her, which could be dangerous. But it really upsets Pip, and so he says to her at the bottom of page 301, It revived my utmost indignation that she was still being pursued by this fellow, and I would take any money or any pains to drive him out of the country. So Pip again thinking that he can buy everybody off. Unfortunately, Pip and Biddy end up with another argument in this chapter. Pip basically is saying, I'm going to come back and I'm going to visit more often. And Biddy doesn't believe him. She sees right through him, and she's right. And so Pip says, Biddy, I made a remark about me coming down here. You didn't say anything. And she says, oh dear me, are you quite sure you will come down and see Joe often? And Pip gets mad. He says, this is a bad side of human nature. So he starts saying that line over again. And when he goes to shake hands goodbye with Joe, he says, I'll come down often. Oh, don't wipe off your blackened hand. And Joe says, never too soon and never too often. But once more, as the mists were rising as I walked away, if they disclosed to me, as I suspect they did, I should not come back. And Biddy was quite right. And all I can say is that they were quite right too. So, spoiler alert, Pip's not coming back. He's not coming back to see Joe and Biddy. How is he going to redeem himself if he won't return to see them? We'll have to wait and find out. Things are about to reach a massive climax, so please stay tuned.